Welcome to Unaltered Black Legend. Imagine this. It's your wedding day. You are 12 years old. The man waiting for you is not someone you love. He's not even someone you know. He's a stranger, 3 times your age, chosen by your father, approved by tradition, and sanctioned by the state. You met him only days ago. By nightfall, he will own your body, your future, and your name. Before dawn, your mother wakes you. She doesn't speak at first. Her hands tremble as she lifts an object you've never seen so close before, a spear. Not ceremonial, not symbolic, a real weapon. Its iron tip is darkened with old blood, said to have pierced flesh and ended a life in battle. She uses that blood-stained point to part your hair, slowly, carefully, strand by strand. As she does, she whispers the same words her mother whispered to her, and her mother before that. Tonight, do not resist. This is not advice. It is a warning. Hours later, you are dragged through the streets of Rome. Not escorted, dragged. A crowd surrounds you, shouting obscene chants about what will soon be done to your body. This isn't a secret ceremony hidden behind palace walls. This is public, celebrated, ritualized. You are carried over the threshold of your new home, a threshold smeared with wolf fat to ward off evil spirits. Incense fills the air. Shadows flicker against the walls. The marriage bed has been placed deliberately in the most visible part of the house, where witnesses cannot pretend ignorance. A knot is untied, a knot that can never be tied again. This is not fiction. This is not exaggeration. This is not a horror film. This is what Roman weddings actually looked like, performed openly, normalized by law, and repeated for over 1,000 years. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Why didn't Rome hide this? Before we answer that, we need to confront a myth you've probably heard before. Jus prime noctis, the so-called rite of the first night. The story goes like this. Evil kings, cruel lords, powerful men claiming the right to sleep with a bride before her husband ever could. It appears in films, medieval legends, and modern outrage, a symbol of unchecked sexual tyranny. But here's the truth. When it comes to ancient Rome, there is no real evidence that this practice ever existed. No Roman laws describe it, no credible contemporary historians mention it, no archaeological records support it. Modern scholars have searched exhaustively, and what they've found is nothing. The idea of jus prime noctis appears to be a later invention, likely medieval propaganda, mixed with humanity's habit of projecting cruelty onto the past to make ourselves feel more civilized. So we can relax, right? The horror was just a myth. Except, it wasn't. Rome didn't need a rite of the first night, because it didn't believe a child bride's consent mattered in the first place. The terror wasn't hidden behind feudal privilege. It was woven directly into tradition, religion, and law. And that is why Rome never felt the need to hide it. Because while that particular nightmare may be fiction, what actually happened to Roman brides was arguably worse. Not worse because it was more violent, though it often was, but worse because it wasn't hidden. It wasn't a corruption of the system. It was the system. It wasn't an abuse of power happening in the shadows. Music. It was power itself, displayed proudly for all of Rome to witness and celebrate. The real horror of a Roman wedding night wasn't that the rules were being broken. It was that everyone was following them perfectly. See, when we imagine ancient abuse, we picture it happening in secret, a crime, something shameful that perpetrators' music hide. But what happens when the abuse isn't hidden at all? What happens when it's written into law, blessed by priests, cheered on by crowds, and considered not just acceptable, but sacred? What happens when the victim is told that her suffering is duty, that her terror is tradition, that her body is not her own, and never was? That's what we're really talking about today. Not a myth, but a documented, systematized, religiously sanctioned ritual that treated women not as human beings with autonomy, but as property to be transferred from one owner to another. And it all started with a weapon. Dawn breaks on a young girl's wedding day in Rome sometime around 100 billions.C. Let's call her Lucia, though her name doesn't really matter. This story could be about thousands of girls across centuries of Roman history. Lucia is 13 years old. She's been betrothed since she was a child music to a man she's met exactly twice. He's 34, a minor government official music with political connections to her father. She knows almost nothing about him except that in a few hours he will have complete legal control over her body, her property, and her very existence. But first, the Hastikabaris, the celibate spear. Her mother and the household. Slaves gather around her in the pre-dawn darkness. There's no gentle brushing, no tender moment between mother and daughter. Music instead, her mother produces a spear, the hasta, and begins the ritual that will transform her from daughter to wife. The spear is inserted into Lucia's hair, and its sharp point is used to meticulously part it into 6 sections. Each section is then braided with ritualistic precision, mimicking the hairstyle of the Vestal Virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses. The entire process takes over an hour. One slip of the hand, one flinch from Lucia, and that spear point could slice her scalp open. Why a spear? The ancient philosopher Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE, offers several theories that Romans themselves debated. Some said it honored Mars, the god of war, in hopes that the marriage would produce strong warrior sons. Others claimed it was a gesture toward military victory and the strength of Rome itself. But Plutarch Music also recorded a darker interpretation, one that cuts closer to the truth. The spear was a deliberate call back to Rome's foundational myth, music, the rape of the Sabine women. Let me tell you that story, because it matters. According to Roman legend, in the city's earliest days, Rome had a serious problem. There weren't enough women. The surrounding tribes refused to let their daughters marry Romans, seeing the new city as nothing more than a haven for criminals and outcasts. So Rome's founder Romulus devised a plan. He invited the neighboring Sabines to a great festival, a celebration of games and religious rites. The Sabines came, men, women, and children, expecting diplomacy and entertainment. Instead, at a prearranged signal, the Roman men attacked. They didn't kill the Sabine men. Not yet. Instead, they grabbed the Sabine women and girls, dragging them away by force while their fathers, brothers, music, and would-be husbands were driven back with swords. The women were distributed among Roman men as wives, not asked, not courted, taken. And according to the myth, these abducted women eventually came, music, to love their captives, even intervening to stop a war between Rome and Sabine when their birth families tried to rescue them. This wasn't a shameful secret in Roman culture. It was a founding myth. It was celebrated in art, referenced in poetry, and yes, reenacted symbolically at every single traditional Roman wedding. The spear wasn't just styling a bride's hair. It was a reminder renewed with every marriage that wives were fundamentally captured, that marriage was in its essence a conquest, that a woman's body was a prize to be claimed by force, sanctified by tradition. And here's what makes this even more chilling. According to some ancient sources, the spear used in the ritual was ideally one that had already killed a man in battle. Music, a weapon literally baptized in human blood, was the first thing to touch a bride on her wedding day. Think about the psychological weight of that moment. You're a young girl in the very first ritual of your wedding. The moment that begins your transformation from maiden to wife is performed with an instrument of death. What message does that send? What does it tell you about what's coming next? The answer is written in every detail of what followed. To understand why these rituals existed, we need to talk about something deeply unsexy but absolutely crucial. Roman law. For most of Roman history, particularly in the Republic, an early empire, the most traditional and prestigious form of marriage was called conventio music in manum, which translates literally as passage into the hand. Here's how it worked. From birth, a Roman woman existed under someone's pestis, their legal power. If her father was alive, she was under his patria, music pedestis, his paternal power. This wasn't just symbolic, it was absolute. He controlled whether she could marry, who she could marry, whether she could own property, and whether she could even keep her own children if she became a widow. In the eyes of Roman law, an unmarried daughter was legally similar to a child, regardless of her age. The in manu marriage ceremony existed for one purpose: music, to transfer that power from father to husband, to literally pass the woman from one man's hand to another's. After the wedding, she was no longer part of her birth family. Not legally, not religiously, not in any sense that mattered under Roman law. She took on the legal status of her husband's daughter. Yes, you read that correctly. In the eyes of the law, her wife was legally equivalent to her husband's child. Any property she might have inherited, now it belonged to her husband. Any legal disputes involving her husband handled them. Her entire legal identity was subsumed into his household. Now, I need to be precise here because Roman marriage law evolved significantly over the centuries. By the late Republic, and especially during the Empire, a different form of marriage called sin manu, without the hand, became increasingly common, particularly among the elite classes. In a senu marriage, a woman could remain under her father's pestis, or if her father was dead and she had no male guardian, she could even gain a degree of legal independence. She could own property, conduct business, and maintain significant autonomy. Some elite Roman women wielded enormous power through senior manu marriages. But, and this is crucial, even as the legal reality changed, the ritual didn't. The ceremonies, the symbolism, the entire theatrical performance of a Roman wedding music continued to be based on the older and manum model. Why? Because these rituals weren't really about the law. They were about power, tradition, and social control. A daughter's consent to marriage was technically required under Roman law. But let's be realistic about what consent meant for a girl who'd been raised from birth, knowing that her father had the absolute right to arrange her marriage, that refusal could bring shame on her entire family, and that she had virtually no other options for her future. She would recite the traditional formula ubu gas ego ga, where you are gas music, I am Gaia. On the surface it sounds like a beautiful vow of partnership, but its deeper meaning was clear. Wherever you go I follow, your identity subsumes mine, your world becomes my world, I am joining you, you are not joining me. And there was one more physical symbol of this transfer, one more lock that needed a key. The cingulum. This was a woolen belt tied around the bride's waist with an incredibly complex knot called the nodus Herculeus. The knot of Hercules. This wasn't decorative, it was symbolic of her virginity, her protected status. Her body is sealed territory. The knot was deliberately difficult to untie, designed to be a puzzle, a challenge. And there was only one person with the right to untie it, her husband on their wedding night in what would come next. As the sun began to set, the most theatrical and psychologically brutal part of the Roman wedding began. The dolum deducture, the procession to the groom's house. This was no music, quiet, dignified walk. This was orchestrated chaos, a deliberate spectacle of mock violence that reenacted step by step the legendary abduction of the Sabine women. First, the groom approached the bride. In front of both families, in front of witnesses, he grabbed her with a display of force. This wasn't gentle. Ancient sources describe him seizing her, pulling her with visible strength from her mother's arms. The bride, for her part, was expected to play her role. She cried out, she struggled. Music she appeared to resist. Was it all performance? Roman writers claimed it was ritualistic, that the bride's apparent reluctance was meant to paint the household gods of her birth family to assure them she wasn't leaving willingly and thus wouldn't anger them. But here's the question that should haunt us. When does performance become reality? When does ritual fear turn into actual terror? If you're a 12-year-old girl being grabbed by a man 3 times your age while your mother screams, at what point does your brain stop distinguishing music between theater and trauma? The procession that followed was a carnival of intimidation. Torchbearers led the way, not subtle candles but massive flaming torches that turned the Roman streets into a tunnel of flickering shadows. Flute players walked alongside, their music high-pitched and otherworldly. And surrounding the bride and groom was a crowd, music friends, family, hired keybrands, random citizens drawn by the spectacle. They sang. Oh, did they sing? These were called Fessine verses, obscene, sexually explicit songs, music, and chants specifically, designed to be as LWD and graphic as possible. The official reason to ward off evil spirits with vulgarity. But imagine being that bride being marched through the streets while a mob of people, some strangers, shouts increasingly explicit descriptions of what's about to happen to your body once you reach that house. Ancient sources, particularly the poet Catullus, preserve some of these verses. I can't repeat most of them here, but they left nothing to the imagination. They joked about the wedding night, about deflation, about the bride's pain and the groom's conquest. They laughed about it. This was considered entertainment. The bride was expected to smile through it all, to accept it as part of the celebration. As the procession wound through Rome's streets, other elements were added to the spectacle. Boys carried the bride's spindle and daft tools of weaving, marching ahead of her as symbols of her future domestic servitude. Someone scattered nuts in the crowd, a fertility symbol, but also a way to draw even more people to watch, to bear witness to this transfer of ownership. When they finally reached the groom's house, music, the doorpost would already be decorated, draped with woolen ribbons and smeared with oils or animal fat. Some sources specifically mention wolf fat, drawing yet another connection to Rome's music founding myth. Remember, Romulus and Remus were supposed to lie raised by a she-wolf. At the threshold, the final act of the abduction took place. The bride was not allowed to walk over the threshold herself. This was crucial. Tripping as you entered your new home was considered an absolutely terrible omen, potentially cursing the entire marriage. So instead, the groom lifted her again, just like carrying captured property and carried her bodily over the threshold. Today, this is one of the few Roman wedding customs music that has survived, and we think of it as romantic. The groom sweeping his bride off her feet, music carrying her into their new life together. But the origin has nothing to do with romance. It's about preventing bad omens and more darkly about physically demonstrating that the bride doesn't enter this house on her own terms. She's music brought in. She's carried in like plunder. The door shut behind them. The crowd remained outside, but the shouting continued for hours, the Fessin verses growing even crudder as wine flowed and inhibitions dropped. Inside, in the sudden relative quiet of the house, the final rituals were about to begin. The atrium, the central hall of a Roman house, was dimly lit with oil lamps and thick with incense, and there positioned prominently in the semi-public heart of the home was the lectus genialis, the marriage bed. Its placement was not accidental. This wasn't tucked away in a private bedroom. This was furniture placed where visitors, clients, and household members would regularly see it. The marriage bed was a statement, a monument to the family's legitimacy and the wife's primary purpose. The bride was led to this bed by the pronuba, a matron of honor who had been married only NCE. This was important. She had to be a univera, a woman faithful to a single marriage, representing the ideal the bride was supposed to embody for the rest of her life. At the bed, the husband approached. The room would likely contain a few select witnesses, perhaps close family members, perhaps trusted friends, though exactly who remained and who left at this point varies in historical accounts. What we know for certain is this: the husband untied the knot of Hercules. This action was loaded with symbolism. The knot represented the bride's virginity, her protected status, her body as sealed territory that was now being opened. Hercules himself was a symbol of masculine strength and, frankly, virility. He was famous in mythology for his sexual conquests, fathering dozens of children. The untying of the knot was not meant to be quick. The complexity of the knot meant the husband had to work at it, music had to struggle with it, while the bride stood there waiting. Every second of that struggle was a reminder of what was about to happen, of what she was about to lose. When the knot finally came undone, the bride's tunic loosened. And here we enter the part of the wedding night that history has worked very, very hard to sanitize, to romanticize, to reframe music as something other than what it was. Modern historians, particularly Paul Vane, in his groundbreaking work on Roman sexuality, have characterized what happened next with startling directness. Vane describes the expected consummation as taking the form of what he calls a legal rape. Now, that's a modern historian's interpretation using modern terminology, not ancient Roman legal language. But Vane chooses that for Asa deliberately, and we need to understand why. The concept of ongoing sexual consent within marriage, the idea that a wife has the right to refuse sex with her husband, that her yes must be enthusiastic and freely given each time, that marital rape is a real and prosecutable crime. This concept did not exist in Roman law. It didn't music exist in most legal systems until shockingly recently in human history. In Roman marriage, particularly in the traditional in manum model, a wife's music body was not legally her own. Her husband had the right, even the duty to consummate the marriage. Her role was music to submit. Her feelings about this submission were legally irrelevant. This wasn't a secret. This wasn't something Romans were ashamed of. It was the point. The wedding night consummation served multiple functions music in Roman society. First, it legally confirmed the marriage. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled. The physical act was the final seal on the contract. Music, second, it established the husband's sexual rights over his wife's body, rights that would continue for the duration of the marriage. Third, and perhaps most importantly to Romans, it opened the possibility of legitimate heirs. The entire point of Roman marriage from a legal and social perspective was to produce children, specifically legitimate male children who could inherit property and carry on the family name. The bride's virginity was crucial because it ensured that any child she bore could be unquestionably attributed to her husband. Her value as a bride was directly tied to her unopened status, her lack of sexual history, her body as unmarked territory. And so on that bed in the atrium, surrounded by incense and shadows, that territory was claimed. Ancient sources are deliberately vague about the specific details of consummation, and modern historians debate exactly how much privacy a couple was afforded. Some sources suggest that witnesses might remain in the room but behind a curtain. Others suggest the couple was left completely alone. The truth probably varied by time period, social class, and individual family customs. But here's what we do know. Whether or not anyone was physically watching, the act itself was performed music, with the full knowledge and expectation of everyone in the house and everyone who had attended the wedding. This wasn't a private moment of intimacy between two people who loved each other. This was a legal requirement, a social obligation, a duty being performed to satisfy family expectations and social norms. For the bride, this first sexual experience would have been many things. It might have been painful. Medical knowledge about female sexuality was primitive, and the idea of ensuring the bride's comfort or pleasure wouldn't have been a priority. It was almost certainly frightening, especially for very young brides, music, who would have had only the vaguest understanding of what sex entailed. But most of all, it was a lesson about her new status, a lesson about her new lack of autonomy, a lesson about what her body was for. And in the morning, there would be proof required. The bloodied sheets from the marriage bed might be displayed, or at least examined, to confirm the bride's virginity. In some periods, and some families, this was done publicly. Her body's most private moment became public evidence. You've made it this far. You're clearly someone who doesn't shy away from history's uncomfortable truths. This is exactly the kind of content, music we create here every single week. The stories that get glossed over, sanitized, or completely erased from popular history books. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell because we're just getting started. Now, let's talk about why this story matters today. So, here's the question that should be bothering you. If these rituals were performed openly, celebrated publicly, and woven into the very fabric of Roman society, why don't we hear about them more? The answer isn't what you might think. Rome didn't try to erase this history. The change happened gradually over centuries through a combination of cultural evolution, religious transformation, and deliberate historical myth-making. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, music in the 4th century CE, these pagan wedding rituals began to shift. The early Christian church had its own complicated relationship with marriage and sexuality. But the overt symbolism of conquest, the spear, the mock abduction, the Fessene verses, these were gradually replaced with Christian ceremonies that emphasized music, different values, at least superficially. But the deeper transformation happened in how later generations chose to remember Rome. From the Renaissance onward, Western civilization developed an almost romantic obsession with classical antiquity. Rome became the model of civilization, of law, of culture. We built our government buildings to look like Roman temples. We studied Latin and Greek. We held up Roman philosophy and engineering as the pinnacle of human achievement. And in that process of glorification, we did what humans always do with uncomfortable history. We softened it. We selected the parts we liked and quietly ignored the parts that made us uncomfortable. We remembered the aqueducts and forgot the spear. We celebrated the Senate and overlooked the systematic legal subjugation of half the population. We marveled at the Colosseum and chose not to think too hard about what the women in the crowd had endured in their own homes. Modern popular culture has perpetuated this sanitized version. Movies and TV shows set in ancient Rome focus on gladiators, emperors, and military campaigns. When they do show Roman marriages, they're often portrayed with modern sensibilities, romantic, consensual, a meeting of equals. Even academic history, until relatively recently, largely overlooked the female experience in Rome. The historians were men writing about men focused on politics and warfare. The public sphere that Roman men dominated the private sphere. The domestic music sphere where women's lives unfolded that was considered less important, less worthy of serious scholarship. It's only in the last few decades that historians like Mary Beard, Sarah Pomeroy, Eve Damra, and Paul Vane have really pushed back against this narrative, using archaeological evidence, ancient letters, medical texts, and legal documents, music, to reconstruct what life was actually like for Roman women. And what they found is deeply uncomfortable. They found that Roman civilization, for all its achievements, was built on a foundation of systematic gender oppression that touched every aspect of a woman's life, from the moment she was born to the moment she died. The wedding night rituals we've discussed today weren't aberrations. They weren't the worst parts. They were just the most visible part of a much larger system of control. After her wedding night, a Roman woman's life continued under her husband's authority. He controlled her property, her social interactions, her body. If he wanted to have sex, she had no legal right to refuse. If she committed adultery, he could kill her under certain circumstances. If he committed adultery, which was incredibly common, she had virtually no legal recourse. Her value was measured primarily in her ability to produce legitimate heirs, preferably male. If she was infertile, she could be divorced. If she had only daughters, she might be blamed for failing in her duty. Her body was a vessel for continuing the family line, not a site of her own pleasure or autonomy. So why does this matter today? Because the echoes of these Roman attitudes about women, marriage, and sexuality didn't die with the Roman Empire. They flowed through the centuries, shaping medieval European marriage customs, influencing the development of Western legal systems, and creating cultural narratives about gender roles music that we're still fighting against today. For centuries, Western law was built on a simple assumption: a wife's body belonged to her husband. That belief wasn't ancient history for most of us. Marital rape was not criminalized in all 50 U.S. states until 1993. Let that sit for a moment. 1993, less than a single lifetime ago. And the ideas behind it, ideas about ownership, obedience, and entitlement, didn't vanish when the laws finally changed. The belief that a woman's value lies in her virginity before marriage, and her fertility within it, still shapes cultures across the world. The notion that marriage is less a partnership and more a transfer of authority, of control, from father to husband, survives in rituals we rarely question. Even something as familiar as a father giving away his daughter carries the echo of that older logic. We like to believe we've outgrown all of this, and in many ways, legally, socially, we have. But progress didn't happen by accident. It happened because these systems were questioned. Because people began to understand that these ideas were not timeless truths or biological inevitabilities. They were constructed, reinforced, normalized, and preserved through rituals like the Roman wedding, rituals designed not just to symbolize power, but to perform it. The Roman wedding night, with its spears, its staged abductions, its public consummation, is a mirror. And what it reflects back is unsettling. It shows a society that didn't merely tolerate control, it celebrated it. A society that turned domination into tradition and violence into ceremony. It reminds us that tradition is often just a polite word for whatever has long served those in power. But the mirror reflects something else too. These systems were never permanent. They were built, and that means they can be dismantled. They already have been, in many places. And they can continue to be. The girl whose hair was parted with a spear, the girl dragged through the streets, the girl carried over a threshold into a life she never truly chose. She existed, and she wasn't alone. Thousands of girls like her lived across centuries of Roman history. Their fear was real. Their pain was real. And so was the effort to erase it, to soften it, romanticize it, and transform trauma into myth. So remembering this history isn't about judging people who lived 2,000 years ago by modern standards. It's about understanding how we arrived here. It's about recognizing that progress is not automatic and rights are not permanent. They are argued for, defended, and sometimes lost, especially when systems claim to be natural, traditional, or sacred. The spear still exists, buried in history. But now we can finally see it clearly. Not a harmless symbol, not a decorative relic, but what it always was, a weapon. And reckoning with that truth begins with telling the story Rome never tried to hide, but that we, for a long time, chose not to see. Thanks for watching. If this changed the way you think about Roman history, or history in general, let me know in the comments. What other romantic traditions do you think deserve a closer, more honest look? And yes, subscribe. We do this every week. Next episode, the Vestal Virgins. You are not ready for what we found.